Right, the final few stanzas of Tissue, and just to reiterate what we've been looking at over the first two parts, we're looking at paper as an extended metaphor. Remember that she's looking at how paper has properties of being fragile, easily destroyed, being transparent and see-through, and she sees all of this as a positive. And if power was like paper, instead of controlling us, we could control the power. It would be easily shiftable, it would be open, it would be accessible to all. So that's the extended metaphor that runs through. The poem itself is really about political power. And that's in comparison to the power we all have as people, which she believes is more important. But it's also about taking in your own identity. There's elements there of religious identity, of identity with our families, of identity within our nations and so forth. So some of those, and we'll bring out some comparisons a little bit later on that you'll probably see behind me already. Okay, final three stanzas. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers, over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make. Find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent, turned into your skin. Okay, now as I keep saying, if you understand the gist of the poem, it's an impressionist poem. If you understand the gist, you understand the idea, then just pick out some of the key quotes, the key lines, the key words that you can look at. The imagery of light is so important. We've got another one, the let daylight break through. So keep looking at the imagery of light, refer to that, paper that lets the light shine through, let daylight break through, transparent, all of that idea that we can see light through, because light is positivity, it's optimism, it's hope. And that really reflects the mood of Darker's poem, that it is a hopeful poem. Okay, now she's talking about how we can build with paper. An architect could use all of this. Now, not just a physical architect in the way we would see an architect, as in somebody who builds buildings. She is referring in that way. But an architect, somebody who builds a new society, a new power structure. Okay, so it's somebody who is designing something new, not necessarily just a building, although she references a couple of buildings later on, but also an architect of a new society, a new structure, a new power dynamic within our own societies. An architect could use all of this, place layer over layer, luminous script, luminous again, light coming through there. If we think of something as being luminous, we think of it as being bright, see-through, giving out light. Script over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block. Notice the enjambment there, that it's continuous, it's continually changeable, and block and brick are so difficult to change. But Darker is suggesting with that enjambment that we can change power structures. Now, she's talking here about how power should be allowed to shift. Never wish to build again with brick or block. And so by building with paper, we can build things that are meant to change. They're meant to shift. Nothing is meant to last forever. That's the idea behind the poem. But let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths. Now, what she's talking about with capitals and monoliths are both buildings of power. They're both sort of from the semantic field of powerful structures, like a parliament building or a cathedral or a palace or something like that. Some place where the government has control. Now, the use of an imperative structure there, let daylight break through, gives a sense of urgency, a sense of a need for all of us to reclaim that power from the bricks and the blocks and the concrete structures that are currently representative of power that lasts, power that can't move, power that can't be flexible. Not for Darker. Let daylight break through. Let that positivity, let that hope and optimism come through and reclaim the power. And it's that sense of urgency that doesn't necessarily come through a lot of the poem, which is much more reflective and much more nostalgic in its tone. Through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue. Now, we're going to talk in a minute about how living tissue is much more important. And I talked earlier on about it being an impressionistic poem, but tissue has that double meaning, which we need to keep going back to. Tissue as in tissue paper, which itself has layers, very fragile, very easily destroyed, very easily moved on the wind, but also human tissue, our flesh, our bones, our muscles. And that, for Darker, is what is much more important. Human beings, not power structures. The humans, the people themselves, are what is important. Trace a grand design with living tissue. Raise a structure never meant to last. So again, instead of building with brick, we build with living tissue so that power structures can change over time. Nobody holds complete power over anyone. It's flexible, it's movable. We're not constrained by that power relationship. And again, she repeats these words of touch, of tactility, smoothed and stroked and thin to be transparent. And if you take those sibilant sound of smoothed and stroked, it sounds tactile, doesn't it? It sounds like we're engaging with the power. So it's power that is in our control, in a way like we might stroke a pet. This is what we have. Power is within us, not artificially constructed by other people. And then we've got the key quote for this particular session, turned into your skin, which I've got down here. Now, the first thing you must notice about turned into your skin is that it's separate from the other stanzas. The other stanzas are all 4 lines long. They're all in blocks. So she's breaking that power structure in itself. She's breaking away from her own structures to show how structure can change. But also, it's left alone on its own. This is something that is important. This is an image that Darker is leaving us with that is particularly crucial. It's the one thing that she wants us to particularly remember. I always talk about conclusions within poems. And when you talk about conclusions, it's the last thing that the poet wants you to remember. It's the final thoughts that he or she wants you to go away from reading the poem with. And when you're talking about comparing poems, you can always compare the conclusions. One poet leaves us on an optimistic note, another poem leaves us on a more pessimistic note. It's a simple way of comparing poems by comparing conclusions. But you've got to look at this as a conclusion. It's the final line. It's meant to be separate. So it's meant to stand out. Imtiaz Darker is almost screaming at us that this is an important line. And she leaves it separate for that reason. And don't forget, as I've just said, it's separate, so it breaks the power structure of the poem, and that is important in itself, that structures are meant to be broken, they're meant to shift, they're meant to move. But also, notice that we've got this second person pronoun there, your skin, it belongs to you. So now, instead of talking more generally, she's directing her language at the reader. It's a direct address, it's an appeal to the reader. You are important, you're the ones who have power. Seize that power, it's turned into your skin. You own your own lives, don't be controlled. And that urgent appeal is the first time she's used that second person. So more so than any other poem in the collection, she really wants us as a reader to engage with that final line. It's separate, it's screaming at us, notice me. We should be taking control of our lives and not be allowing ourselves to be controlled elsewhere. But also turned into your skin. So again, we're talking about living tissue that she's mentioned. We're talking about flesh and bone, and it's the importance of people. The importance of people over the importance of any power construct that any government or ruling body is trying to come up with. Much more important than money, much more important than borderlines and maps, much more important than passports. It's living tissue that really matters. But that second person is so important there. So there's at least 4 things that you can say. It's separate, it breaks the rules, it shows that the power structure of the poem even shifts. It's a direct address, and it's showing the importance of people. So a really important final conclusion that Imtiaz Darker is leaving us with. So as we finish in the third part of this session on tissue, we need to be thinking about what poems it goes well with. It's not yet been used as the named poem, so it could easily come up from AQA. It is a difficult one, but instead of thinking of its difficulty, think about which images can I pick out that I can really understand. And hopefully I've come up with at least 3, if not 4 or 5 images that you can talk about in a little bit more detail. But where does it particularly link? Well, these are the 3 poems that I think it links best with. There are links across all of the poems. All of them are about power and conflict. But the really key one that it goes with is Emigre. It's a similar sort of tone. There's images of light in Emigre, just as there are in Tissue. So there's a direct comparison that you can make there. Emigre, of course, talks about enforced movement from one country to another and losing her control by somebody else moving her. So it really fits in with this idea that other people are in control of our lives, but that positivity comes through. So loads of really good comparisons to be made with Emigre. But London and Checking Out My History are both really about how power is enforced upon us from someone else. In London, it's the nameless state, really, that charters the Thames, that regulates the streets, that keeps the people in their mind-forged manacles. And in Checking Out My History, it's John Agard talking about how the British government controls the education system and therefore controls his access to his own identity. So it's a poem just like this one about how power is constructed elsewhere, but the difference is in London and Checking Out My History is that power is enforced through those, whereas Imtiaz Darker is suggesting through Tissue that power shouldn't be enforced upon us, it should be more shiftable. So more comparisons there. Emigre has similarities and differences which make it a really good poem that you could link. Any of those 3 would work.